I want to say a word about Bob Neer. Bob and I met yesterday, and Bob and Mary, thank you so much for the honor of being here in this role as the first lecturer in the series. And thanks for the contribution you've made to this university. It's really quite remarkable. And I want to say a word too about a hero of mine, John Cobb. John, where are you? John is somebody I began to read way back in the 1970s as a process theologian, and then had the honor of helping to hold an event in a place that we had in Arkansas for a review panel that was reviewing John and Herman Daly's wonderful book, a landmark book called For the Common Good. It's still in print from Beacon Press. And John, we just owe you a debt for helping to be one of the seminal thinkers in this era and connecting theology with all the big issues of our time. So it's great to see you again. I don't know how much time we have. Mark said just talk as long as you want to, and that would take you to dinner time and past cocktail hour here in La Verne. I do want to talk for maybe 30, I'm going to cut this a little shorter than it is, so I'm going to flip through some of the slides a bit faster, but we've come into a new era. By the way, can all of you hear me in the back? Is this loud enough? We've come into a new era, and it's being given a name. It hasn't been officially recognized yet, but the Anthropocene. So we've come from the Holocene into this new era by whatever name, and people who make the decisions about how we name geologic eras will have a choice to make, whether Anthropocene, and there's some other possibilities, but it's a new era. And I want to describe what I think are some of the major features of this new era and what it means for us, and then specifically what we need to do about it or what we can do about it. So what I'm going to say is taken very much from my next book, which comes out from Yale University Press this summer. It's called Dangerous Years, Climate Change, the Long Emergency, and the Way Forward. And so the first half of the talk is really depressing. It's all the big numbers, and then the second half is what we do about this. So just fasten your seatbelt for the first part of the talk, and we'll get through the depressing part. Let me start with population. And we were, Bob and I and others last night were talking about the issue of population growth has disappeared from the public agenda. It did so for primarily political reasons, but the numbers of people on the planet, and the debate about population has gone through, as many of you will remember, an interesting history. In 1972 at the Stockholm Conference, the first global environmental conference held under UN auspices, it was white folks shaking their, affluent white folks shaking their finger at mostly brown and black and yellow people and saying, you need to stop breeding. By the time it got to Cairo and Beijing, as the years went on, the debate became less one about demography and at least as much about consumption, because it was affluent people that were doing most of the damage on Earth. But in the meantime, the growth has continued, and there's no way to deal with this without dealing with lots of other issues. And so sustainability as an issue and the transition into this, whatever the era is going to be called, Anthropocene or whatever, means that we now can no longer deal with issues as if they're isolated. And so fairness and decency and women's rights and the possibilities of opportunity, equal opportunities for everybody became part of that dialogue, and really the most important part of the dialogue. But the numbers are what the numbers are. And the projections, the median UN projection is by the end of the century, 11 billion people will be on the planet, and they'll want to live more or less as Americans do. The second major feature of the Anthropocene is that we have managed throughout the past 200 years, and particularly the past 50 years, to change the atmospheric chemistry, the chemistry of the atmosphere, in ways detrimental to civilization. You've all seen charts like this, and 2015 was the hottest year on record, as you all know. Not by a little bit, but by a great deal. And 2016 is on track, I'm told, to be hotter even yet. The last 30 years were hotter than in Europe than any time in the past 2,800. This is a section, if you fly over parts of the boreal forests of Canada and Alaska and a good bit of the Rocky Mountains, this is what you see. It's pine bark beetle damage for the most part. And the pine bark beetle survives through winters that are warmer than they used to be and so forth. And then you see lots of pictures like that. That's UK in 2015. This is the decline of sea ice in the Arctic, and it is catastrophic. And these things begin to get into our knowledge of climate science because decline of sea ice changes the albedo or the reflectivity at the very top of the Earth. And seawater is darker in color, and so it absorbs more heat, and so we trigger a carbon cycle feedback is a technical phrase for it. In other words, the hotter it is, the hotter it will get. And then these are some of the most remarkable science humans have ever done, is to begin to track the way Earth systems work. And in particular, the gases and temperature relationship between methane and carbon dioxide, other heat-trapping gases, and temperature, and the record is pretty firm. And people can debate a bit about what causes what, but that's not important to us this afternoon. But we know these things go in lockstep, and the record goes back hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. This is the chart that I think probably bears the most attention, because we are on track for something like a 2 to 4 degrees centigrade warming. Elizabeth Colbert, the writer for The New Yorker, and I were on stage together at an event 2 nights ago at Oberlin College, and the first question I asked her was can we hold the warming of the planet to 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is the new goal that came out of the COP21 meeting in Paris? And her answer was very quickly no. We've already warmed the Earth a bit more than 1 degree centigrade, and that's centigrade, not Fahrenheit. We have another probably ½ degree centigrade, some such number, already in the pipeline. And so it will continue to warm. Could we hold it at 1.5 degrees? Her attitude or her view is not likely. It used to be that 2 degrees centigrade warming was thought to be the guardrail that kept civilization from plunging into some kind of abyss. And in 2008, it was part of an effort to generate something called the President's Climate Action Plan, and John Holdren, the President's science advisor and one of the very prominent voices over a number of decades in climate and environmental issues. He's a physicist by training. I asked John what would happen after 2 degrees centigrade warming, and he didn't want to answer the question. It was emotional for him, and he actually teared up when I put the question to him. So we're at a point where we would prefer not to be. The 4 degrees centigrade warming is every scientist's nightmare. It is probably a result of something that occurs with methane or CH4. Methane is a much more potent heat-trapping gas than carbon dioxide. Shorter lived, it eventually turns into CO2, but shorter lived in the atmosphere. But a methane spike, if we warm seawaters and boreal forest soils enough, there will be a massive, what's called a burp of methane in the atmosphere, and that is everybody's nightmare. This is Dubai and Persian Gulf, and this is a slide is taken from an issue of Nature Climate Change, which is one of 3 or 4 of the authoritative journals, scientific journals in the field. The point of the slide is simply to say that by sometime mid-century or just a bit after maybe, parts of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf will be uninhabitable by humans. Uninhabitable. That is the path that we're on. And this is, it takes no imagination to see the ripple effects that go out from that condition of violence and hatred. And this is a part of the world where people don't much like us for whatever good reason or bad reason, but we're not popular in this part of the world. And there are nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, and there's terrorism and all these other things, and they all begin to flow together. But the theory that we've been operating with is you can turn the thermostat of the Earth up a bit and nothing else changes or wobbles someplace else, and that's simply not the world in which we live. And then this is the result. This will have very human faces. Part of the difficulty is putting a human face on the realities that we have created. And we are, and I've said this for years, and other people have said it as well, but we are very, very good at responding to direct, dependably loathsome threats. So if it has long hair and sharp teeth and claws and so forth, we're very good. We were wired for that. Our amygdala kicks in and the fight-flight response comes about, and all our hormones work to make us fearsome in combat situations, but not for things like this. This hits a whole different range of possibilities. And then on climate change in the Anthropocene, it is by most scientists' estimation, it is the distinguishing trait of the Anthropocene. It isn't a quick kind of thing. And this hits Americans, I think, where we are weakest, because carbon stays in the atmosphere for a long time. And so when Susan Solomon, part of the IPCC group, in the fourth IPCC report a few years ago said that were we to stop emitting heat-trapping gases today, the Earth would continue to warm, seas continue to rise, ecologies continue to change, and so forth for 1,000 years or longer. David Archer puts it at the longer version. But the carbon we release today, some large fraction of that, will still be changing the climate or affecting climate 10,000 years from now. Now, that doesn't hit us where we as Americans are culturally conditioned to respond. We're very good at solving mechanical problems, direct physical issues sometimes, but this isn't solvable in the way we typically use the word solvable. Is that understandable? This is a slow, long-term problem, and we dug a very deep hole, and we can expect or we can hope that there's some mechanical device that would suck carbon out of the atmosphere, but in fact, when you think about the probabilities of that device or those devices have to themselves be carbon neutral. They have to be deployed at a pace that really does affect the problem at a scale that draws roughly 9 billion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere, and that just breaks even. Not CO2, but just carbon, so that breaks even. And it's got to be affordable. And most of all, we need leadership to move in this direction, but that is not probable for any one of those reasons. The literature on climate change is now more than abundant. And I would point out a couple of books here, namely Oreska's book, which traces the reasons for a good bit of the denial industry is well worth reading. She's a historian at Harvard. David Archer's book, The Long Thaw, is excellent. Philosophical, these two are excellent philosophically. The science is here. This is my book, which is, I won't say anything about. But it's available out here for sale, and today only for $19.95. I want to go to a second problem. I see no way to solve the crises of the Anthropocene that are multiple and many and interwoven and intertwined without dealing with issues of militarism. And it has been growing in force and power. We now spend something like $1.3 trillion a year fighting wars or for defense budget, and probably a like amount for surveilling the planet, and a good bit of money spent to surveil ourselves. But it's an amount that we don't know, but it's well over $1 trillion, I'm sure. But we've become a militaristic nation. And I think in the process, we've become the most fearful people on the planet, and perhaps the most feared on the planet. Dwight Eisenhower had a different view, and I won't read the slides here, but militarism has penetrated pretty deeply into our psyche. And we hear debates, and candidates will compete on who can be the most militant and aggressive and macho, and who can make the sand in the Middle East glow the most, and so forth. And so we become a militaristic people. I see no way that the United States could continue to spend more than the rest of the world combined on weapons and war fighting and arrive at a peaceful outcome. And yet that is not on the agenda. I have heard nobody, Democrat or Republican, talk about the excess, well, maybe Bernie Sanders, talk about the excess money being spent on militarism and what else we don't spend. Eisenhower's quote in the previous slide pointed out the opportunity cost. Every dollar spent for military weapons is a dollar not spent for schools and medical care and infrastructure and so forth. And the reason for this, in part, is simply money. Weapons merchants have a long and dubious history, but as Eisenhower pointed out, and he pointed out the connection between the military-industrial complex and various kind of outcomes and so forth. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si this past year, put it rather more bluntly, as I've got on the screen. And then there's this, and I asked students in a class this morning how many favored capitalism and so forth, and almost everybody in the class favored capitalism, but I don't think anybody favors it in its current version. except people like Rex Tillerson here on the screen. And one of the things that has come out, I want to say two things about this. One is that ExxonMobil, we now have good reason to believe, knew that the burning of oil, their stock for sale, would affect the climate in catastrophic directions as early as 1977. We now know or have good reason to suspect that many other oil companies had the same thing, and all the holders of fossil fuels knew that this would do no good. It might make them very rich people, but beyond some point it would fry the planet and destroy human possibilities. But now notice about this, because they can burn all of their reserves and move us closer to frying the planet, and they would break no law. There is no law, there's not even a tissue paper of legal doctrine that would stop them from doing this. And their business plan is to burn lots and more. So they spend something, if I remember the number correctly, something like $64 million a day to find more sources of carbon energy that we can burn. And the other thing raised by this is simply the role of corporations, and I'll say a word about this in just a moment, but the role of corporations and the belief that corporations constitute legal persons. You and I are persons, but we can only be in one place at one time. We're mortal, we die, our assets are limited, but corporations are effectively eternal. They can be all over the planet. They don't die, and despite all the talk that we hear from corporations about that effectively is greenwashing, corporations have no conscience. They're simply pools of money looking for the highest rate of return. That is not an anti-corporate statement. That's almost a direct quote from the corporate literature itself. And then there's this issue. As we come into the Anthropocene, we are a divided people, divided in lots of different ways, not the least of which is wealth. And so you could put easily 400 people in this room and they would have more net wealth than the bottom 185 million Americans. The Oxfam report recently showed that 62 people planet-wide had more net wealth than the bottom 3.7 billion people on the earth. And so I don't think that's unrelated to the fact that in a good many ways America has moved toward becoming a third world country. And again, I'm not getting into politics here, it's just the numbers where we stack up. And we used to be, when I was a kid growing up a million years ago in the 50s, we were #1 in everything. Now we're number 18, 19, 20, 21 out of the developed nations, and there are only 21 being talked about. So this shows the wealth of that top 62 or the oligarchy, and this is the wealth of the rest of the world. And I don't see this as a road or pathway to anything like sustainability. At some point, I think that we've got to come to grips with the wide distribution of wealth. And that's not an argument for communism or socialism. It's just simply to say that where an oligarchy will rule or plutocracy, sustainability is not a likely outcome. And we can debate that later, and if you'd like to. This is a map in the New York Times, and everything in dark blue are parts of the country that did not recover after 2008. And so many parts of the country did really quite well. And you look at that map and kind of mentally overlay the votes for Donald Trump and the anger in American society. They didn't in the New York Times, but it's not a hard map to make. But if you track votes of angry, mostly white, middle income or lower income males, heavily in the South, rural and so forth, I think that map would basically lay pretty well over the darker blue of this map, which is strictly about income and economic development. And then I'm in this part of the world. You notice a number of red dots. The red dots represent cities that are the top 10, the bottom 10 in terms of economic recovery. And so Cleveland and Detroit and Flint, Michigan, of course, and so forth, are on that list. There's another way to think about this, and I just stuck this slide in because I think that there is a different way to think about capitalism and the way income is distributed. Peter Barnes and my friend Bob Costanza have proposed for some time an Earth Atmospheric Trust. And I won't get into this beyond saying that if capitalism is a good thing, then let's have more of it. Let's have more capitalists. And we all should own parts of this Earth Trust. And so Peter Barnes has proposed a Earth Atmospheric Trust, and a bunch of us have jumped on bandwagon. It makes perfect sense, but it would provide an income, stable income for people from the fees charged people who have been using the atmosphere as a sewer for forever and made a lot of money out of it. The literature on economics, and just put this up here because as a professor, I assign books to read. And so there's some often, here we have another interesting technology issue. Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson's book is excellent on spirit level. And what they've done in the book is to track the effects, the social effects of inequality. And virtually every bad social trend is worsened by inequality. Thomas Piketty, the French economist, got a lot of play with this, and it's an excellent book. It's interesting because what he does in a way is to revive some of the debate about Marxism in the book. And Joseph Stiglitz, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, book on inequality. Put this in here because how is it we could have a political campaign at the highest level in which the major issues of the Anthropocene, well documented, well recorded, in some cases potentially fatal to civilization, the human enterprise, and they do not appear in the debate. Part of the reason is this, and I want to detour very quickly into politics. This is my electoral district. And Jim Jordan, who is either the most conservative or the second most conservative congressperson in U.S. Congress, is our representative. And so this is called gerrymandering. And you can gerrymander a district if your goal is to have a district that favors left-handed, blue-eyed, coke-drinking, short Lithuanians, you could do it. The software exists. And all over the country, legislatures make decisions about how these electoral districts are carved up. So both parties do it. This is not this is a bipartisan form of corruption, but what it has given us is a Congress increasingly divided into safe districts, left and right. And so if you're in a safe district, if you're a liberal, you're going to skip you can do whatever you want. You can say whatever you want. Your chances of being reelected are nearly 100%. The same is true at the conservative end. Now, this is no way to run a democracy because nobody has an incentive to come into the middle and compromise. That's just simply not part of the deal. But there are reasons why that is the case. And if you look at poll data, Americans are themselves, we're pretty reasonable people individually. But we've gotten divided politically. And so that explains part of the discrepancy between poll data, what we really want in the world, and the kind of policies that we get. There's this Grand Canyon chasm between what we as people want and the science and so forth and what we know, and even about climate change. If you ask Republicans and Democrats alike, the majority of both parties now say it's real and humans are causing it. They would prefer to have clean air, clean water, solar power, and so forth. But you see this massive discrepancy, but there are reasons behind it. I want to say a few things more, and then I want to get into the positive side of this. Edmund Burke, the founder of modern conservatism, wrote a book that still is wonderful reading. It was his Reflections on the Revolution in France. It was written in 1790. And in that book, Burke makes such an eloquent case out that any generation is merely a trustee, a midway between a distant past and a distant future. And the obligation as trustees was to pass on what he called an entailed inheritance onto the future generations. And by entailed inheritance, he was saying, as a good conservative, it was about culture and religion and laws and all these things, these hard-fought gains of civilization. If Burke were alive now, knowing what we now know about ecology, he would go one step deeper, that entailed inheritance of laws and religion and institutions and so forth would also include clean air and clean water and all of the ecological requisites on which that entailed inheritance rests. Is that clear? That would be real conservatism. And I don't think that's a stretch. And you can get the same thing identically from the other part of the political spectrum, from Thomas Jefferson, where he said no generation had the right to pass debt on to succeeding generations. And so part of the challenge of this Anthropocene requires that we restore the integrity of public words. And I put this in here, particularly in election year, because I think a good bit of our language has been corrupted. And it's been corrupted for good reasons, I think. It makes some people a lot of money. But we become divided when we shouldn't have been divided. The point of this list of words is to say that several things. One is that in facing the challenges of the Anthropocene, the solutions will depend on robust and I think thoroughly democratic institutions. it'll require a level of citizenship that is really quite extraordinary, one we haven't seen here for, I think, in this country for decades. Not at the presidential level and not at the good bit of our national politics. But it depends on us thinking clearly about language and words. It was George Orwell who, perhaps more than anybody else in the 20th century, said the fastest way to corrupt a society is corrupt its words. So the words no longer mean what they're supposed to say. So I put patriotism here. What does patriotism mean in the Anthropocene? What does that word mean relative to the carbon balance? Conservatism is a perfectly good word. I think of myself as a conservative in lots of ways. But as a Burkean conservative, passing on an entailed inheritance, I've got 4 grandkids, and passing on some kind of semblance of law and justice and institutions. And conservatism is kind of like an anchor in society. It says, if it worked in the past, keep it. Have good reason to change things. And that's a wonderful way to see the world. Liberalism, on the other hand, is to change things, and it's based on a very different set of beliefs that we can actually improve certain things that are old. That is a worthy dialogue between liberals and conservatives, and it's broken down. But I'm old enough to remember a different era when liberals and conservatives could talk to each other. And they did socialize, and they didn't condemn each other. And you weren't evil because you had a different set of views. And you could have a dialogue in which you recognize that all of us at some point on some issues will be liberal, and on other issues be conservative. And that will change over time. It's just called maturity, and it's called thinking, being a thinking citizen. And we have differences of opinions that should be honored, not condemned. And politics is a noble thing to do, public service and government, and these are things that we ought to honor. And taxes, Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, the Supreme Court Justice, that's the price we pay for civilization. They're not automatically a bad thing. So if it can't be done in the market, if it's otherwise a good purpose and it benefits the public, you have to pass taxes to do it. And it does cost something to run a civilization. So markets can do a lot, but they won't do all of that. Liberalism in my community has been hammered, but I just put this list up here. These are things we got from liberalism. And you could put another list for things we've gotten from conservatism. But my point here is that we need to restore a civil civic dialogue. And it has faded out in this country. And if you tune in radio per linear inch in American radio, there's more venom and more hatred, and that has to be changed. I see no way to get through the Anthropocene safely into something we would call safe harbor or sustainability or resilience or whatever the words you use without changing and improving the civic dialogue. All right, that's all the bad news, and that's all the, what do we do about this? This is my little town of Oberlin, Ohio. And I showed this picture several years ago, and I just kind of casually mentioned that we took this picture. This picture was taken by a first-year student at Oberlin that we strapped to a helium-filled balloon and with an electronic camera download. And I said, Bob, we missed him a lot. He was a nice kid. He didn't transfer from Oberlin. He just kind of drifted away, but we miss him. A woman came up afterwards who thought I was perfectly serious and said, you know, you shouldn't treat your students like that. So this was actually taken by a balloon. We are a small town, 10,000 people, give or take. Founded in 1832. We were the first college to accept African Americans and women and graduate them. So we have, that's part of our institutional DNA. We are Rust Belt. You'll see a map shortly that places us where we are, but Detroit's 84 miles away, Cleveland 35 miles away, Youngstown, Ohio about 75 miles away. We're Rust Belt, and wherever that region goes, the economic gravity mass will take us with it. We set out to do something different, and as a college, we are the major economic driver within a community of 10,000, the largest employer, the largest pot of money, and so we set out to do something about it. I went to a new president, the man I work for. My title at Oberlin is counselor to the president, so I don't teach anymore, but I work as a fundraiser and developer for the president's office. But we said, what difference can we make here? And most colleges tend to look inward. We said, let's look outward, because where Oberlin goes and where this region goes, that's where we're going. You can't imagine a first-rate college in a community with boarded-up storefronts and a poverty level above 25% and so forth. That wouldn't work. So we put together what was called the Oberlin Project. These are the goals of it. And we wanted to be, number one, carbon neutral. Could you make a community entirely carbon neutral? There's a network of large cities aiming to be that, and could we do this in a small town first and be a bench lab scale experiment in getting through this part of the challenges of the Anthropocene? We are a driver in the local economy. And so one of the goals is, as we spend our money, could we spend it and invest in ways that improve the local economy? Our poverty level is about 20%, and it goes up to 25 or 26% in really hard times. Could we grow 70% of our food locally? We've been importing food from California for a long time, but with the California drought, the handwriting's on the wall. We can't import food at a volume we need at a price we could afford much longer. We're going to have to reinvent agriculture in Ohio. We used to be a state of 250,000 farms, mostly mixed farms, and now we're mostly in a state of 50,000 very large farms that grow corn and soybeans, which are shipped out to the Midwest for farm feedlots. And the residues of nitrogen and so forth go down the Mississippi River, and that's the dead zone off the mouth of the Mississippi, larger than the state of New Jersey. And then could we do all this and raise the civic IQ of the public? And so this is a very public enterprise. And then if we do all these things and more, we have 8 major goals beyond this, some not on the screen. If we do all this, could we extend this? Could we take it to scale? And I'll say a few words about that at the very end. But this is where we started. We are separate from the college. The Oberlin project itself is midway between the city, the college, and the community. The starting point for me was this building. Mark referred to this. This is the Adam Joseph Lewis Center. This was my project back in the 1990s. I went to Oberlin in 1990, and the environmental studies program had no place to be, and so I got permission to build a building for this, and we built what was effectively a U.S. Green Building Council Platinum building before there was a rating system. Entirely solar powered. We produce a surplus we sell back on the grid. It is a zero discharge building, drinking water in, drinking water out. And the way the building, but it's just a building. So the way the building came about was, for me, particularly important. We did this, since it was my project, I said, let's do this as an educational venture. And so we opened the doors to anybody that wanted to come in, townspeople and all students and anybody that wanted to come in. So we had 13 public design charrettes. And a charrette is just a big planning meeting. Just say, y'all come, you have a room like this and lots of white paper and boards, and ideas get spilled out. And what emerges from that is the building program. But the goal was to begin to get students engaged in thinking about what this would be like. And they'd never been involved in this before. Buildings mostly happen by, call goes out from a college president's office, and a couple years later, a building's parachuted down on site, done by some New York firm, and that doesn't work very well. But certainly students don't learn much from this. But architecture is a kind of crystallized pedagogy. Every building tells, and every room tells a story of some sort, or it says to the users that there is no story to be told. So where materials came from and how it came to be is not part of the what people learn in it. So we did this building. Students were engaged in it, 13 public design charrettes. The college didn't want a pond because they were afraid that students would skinny dip in a pond, as one of the administrators told our students. It was a late Saturday afternoon, and then one of the students yelled back at the administrator and said, well, if that's your fear, our nightmare is that you administrators will come over and skinny dip in our pond. This wasn't all high-class conversation, but it was interesting nonetheless. The deal was that we could, I had to raise the money for it, but I could not go to any donor otherwise likely ever to give the college. And my joke about that is, I said, well, that leaves me the Columbia Drug Cartel, and they said, no, we'll take it from them too, so you find someone else. So anyway, it came about, and one thing that's important about this, we learned several things about it. One is that this was done in the 1990s. The economics worked out, in fact, quite well. It came in at the high end of average in a very vigorous bid market in Northeast Ohio at that time. So every construction company had a lot of stuff going on. But we came in at the high end of average, but the collateral benefits, which we weren't very good at tracking, were terrific. We got over 1,000 pieces of publicity out of this building, and it continues to trickle in. That is worth a good bit. The yield to the college, which is the number of students who actually show up for classes after being admitted, there's a percentage difference there. The yield of the college went up because kids wanted to be part of something that was positive, and they loved ecological design. So we've included ecological design in our curriculum. How do you make things that fit on the planet with the biosphere? Make them lovely, powered by sunshine, and protect diversity, and so forth. But the main thing was kids learned that the world is still rich in possibilities. You can do things. And so when students came back to the building, after being out for 10 years or whatever, they reflect back on it. They didn't think it would happen, but it did happen. And one of the goals we've got as I go through the talk is how do we energize young people to begin to step up into leadership roles earlier in their careers? You don't have to be 55 and at the threshold of your first heart attack, to do major things in the world. Last month, the building was named one of 30 game changers of the past 170 years by Construction Design and Building magazine. And so the publicity continues to come in to the college. But this is the back of it. It's a laboratory in sustainability. This is all part of the working landscape. The far side has a lot to do with diversity. There's a pond there that has plants and animals that were native to the region before European settlement. An interior shot, that's the roof. That's one of the 2 photovoltaic arrays that power the building. We generate about 160 kW on site. And then to extend this to the town, Oberlin's a very typical little town in Ohio. And if you drive through the downtown, it looks great. It's kind of quaint and rustic and so forth. But if you don't sell, if you're part of the local economy and you're not selling pizza and coffee or beer, your business is in trouble. And the economy is very thin. It's very fragile. So one of our goals is to improve the economy. Here's how we started it. We've organized the community around different teams. And we gave this a name, Full Spectrum Sustainability, that Mark used in the introduction. And all that means is you're going to have lunch with lots of different kinds of people. And so full spectrum means that if you want to do something in terms of economics and agriculture and so forth, you better have bankers present at the conversation. And you better have farmers present. And if you want to recreate the local farm economy, this is not where young people are going right now. They want to go off into computer business or other kinds of things. But if you want to rebuild the agricultural system, you better teach them something about farming and animals and how to string barbed wire and do all the things that farmers used to know how to do a great deal. And so training needs to be there. So this full spectrum sustainability, long story short is, everybody needs to be in this conversation. It cannot be done by any single profession. It cannot be done just by economists or certainly not by professors. It's got to be a broad-based conversation. To start that, we passed out copies of a wonderful essay by Donella Meadows. And Donella Meadows was died way too soon in life, but she was a brilliant, brilliant woman. Had a PhD from MIT in systems dynamics. And Donella wrote this article based on a conversation in a meeting. And we all live our lives in organizations. And the question is, how do you change organizations? And so she listed here in inverse order the ways you change systems. Here's the stuff she said we argue about most. But mostly it slows it down. This is arguing about policy and taxes and all these kind of wonky things. We get very bitter there and so forth. But if you want to change the world, her point was, you had to come down here and change consciousness. And this is the hardest thing to do. This is St. Paul on the road to Damascus. It's the metanoic conversion, where all of a sudden you see the world differently than you once saw it. And you have that aha feeling. Now, you can quarrel with this. The point here in Oberlin, we had about 250, 300 people debate this for several days. And the point, this was not to be scriptural. The point was to get people thinking about how do you change the system, whether it's La Verne or it's Oberlin or it's the Pentagon or General Motors, but how do you change, where do you intervene in the system? And we're going to live there, my students and yours will live their lives in systems and organizations until their retirement. And they're then in another kind of organization. So, and you can quarrel with this. You can say that, say the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had the effect of changing consciousness down here. So there's a more complicated relationship here, but the point was not to be scriptural. The point was to say, how do you change these things? And then for me, one of the ways to change something, as with the Lewis Center and the rest of the slides you're going to see in just a moment, we're visual creatures. We tend to believe what we see. And so some 70% of our sensory apparatus is directly or indirectly connected to our eyes. And you can say the reverse is also true. We see what we believe, but that's another subject. So making sustainability visible is really, really important. So this is our downtown. This is the Tappan Brothers, a square named after the Tappan Brothers. This square is 13 blocks, or 13 acres. This block is also 13 acres. And these are both owned by the college. This is our main street here, and it comes down here, very small, typical Ohio downtown. This is the Allen Art Museum. It's a Cass Gilbert building built in 1917. It's ranked number 4 or number 5 among art museums on college campuses behind Harvard, Yale, Williams College, and then there's Oberlin. The collection is worth probably over $1 billion or $2 and so forth. It is a magnificent facility. This is one of the first things that we did. This was renovated at the LEED Gold level. That's a hard thing to do in 1917 building, but the art collection is very valuable there, so we had to do it. This is the Performing Arts Center, and Oberlin students and townspeople put on some amazing performances, and this will get $20 to $30 million of remake here. Then this is the worst hotel ever. It was built to the really tough design and comfort standards of motor hotels about 1955, which is the year it was built. It is awful. The president of the college is an attorney, and he was sitting in an audience once when I said that this was the Oberlin Inn is a plausible excuse for limited nuclear war. And he said, he rushed up afterwards, David, don't ever say that again. No, he was thinking lawsuits, so I don't say that anymore. I've taken that out of my talks. This is, but here, the point, there's a serious point here. This block, we renamed the Green Arts District. Great art, great performing art. The Conservatory of Music, which is world famous, is right down the block, and we'll have a jazz club here, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But could we make sustainability something other than kind of a finger wagging, you know, did you have your tofu today kind of conversation? Could it be a conversation that includes art and music and poetry? And oh, by the way, it's all solar powered, and the food came from local farms and so forth. You know, could you have a wider dialogue about sustainability? So the point here is to begin to create the backdrop for that wider dialogue. This is the hotel we're just about to finish. This is the hotel park, commercial space here, jazz club down in the basement. This is a conference center. This is the Performing Arts Center right here from the side. The rest of the Oberlin Inn will come down. We've taken half of it down so far. The rest of it will come down starting next month. This is ready. We're ready to rent rooms here. This will be a major conference center. We're doing a big event on October 6th through 8th on the Next Economy with 20 or 25 major economic thinkers and business people and philanthropists and so forth and media people at that event. Right across the street is a $17 million project completed about 4 or 5 years ago. This was done mostly by 3 students, 3 former students. You'll see their picture in just a moment. 33 condominiums upstairs, commercial space in the downstairs, including the best coffee shop in the entire county. But this was done as a way to begin to anchor the redevelopment of the downtown. People moved out of the downtown, and we were told there was no market for people living in the downtown, but people want to live outside the suburbs, and that in fact is not where real estate developers are telling us the market is. These are the 3 kids. They've gone on to form a development company. They're working in Cleveland now. They finished another big project, both hyper successful, making money, and they've got a 3rd project underway right now. This is an entirely solar powered house done by a retired professor. This is a different version of that house, groundbreaking. We want to say, could you do a passive solar house at an affordable price? And so the German passive house standard, we diluted the standard just a little bit, but this is a groundbreaking, and this is the buyer. It was a single mother with 2 kids living below the poverty line. This is the back of the house. It is entirely solar powered. Walls are R40, ceilings are R60, the floor is R20. This is very close to the German passive house standard. She has no electric bill. And begin to look at how we change things. Here's where technology is coming to our rescue. This is the price for photovoltaics. My wife and I built a photovoltaic powered house right about here, 1980. And we paid $1 million I mean, not literally, but we paid a lot per kilowatt hour. Now the price has dropped where solar electric is competitive pretty much every place in the country, and becoming more so without all the disadvantages of burning coal. And it's rather like wind power. Wind power is the largest wind state in the country is the state of Texas, I believe. And but wind power, photovoltaics, advanced technology is moving very rapidly. This is a 11-acre PV array we installed 3 years ago. Had we done this array last summer, the cost would have been 1/2 of what we paid 3 years ago. That array 3 years back, however, still penciled out just fine for the Oberlin Board of Trustees that are mostly lawyers, business people, and financiers. The economics worked then. They would work much better now. So we're in the process of deploying another roughly 2.75 megawatts. By the way, for those of you not familiar with the terms, all of Oberlin, our base load 24/7 power is 11 megawatts. We peak at about 22. So this is a major way to shave off a big part of that peak. By the way, I forgot to say about the hotel. We've allocated a good part of this array to power the hotel so that when it comes online, U.S. Green Building Council accepts off-site power production. The hotel that you saw will be the first, as far as I know, entirely solar-powered hotel conference center in the United States. And that, again, is in a state where sunshine is a theory. We do know it exists, but it can be done in places that are very cloudy. We're starting a community solar project, and I'll just skip through this and get to the end of the talk. This, we expected at the organizing meeting that we might have maybe 10 or 12 people there. This picture I took before, just as we were getting started. There was standing room only at the public library. There is incredible interest in solar. So we're aiming to start a solar-powered or solar company, an installation company, and one that also does housing. So we've got 2 companies in mind as part of the economic development strategy to keep people there, to deal with poverty and do it in a way that advances all kinds of other goals. This is kind of a short list of what we've done so far. We've spent about $106 million to revive the downtown. Most of that's investment money. Most of that's returning a very good rate of return. The hotel opens later this month. The conference center will be early summer. We've got lots of other things we're doing. We've got a 14-acre development. We want to attract a major developer to come in and do a very hyper-green, entirely solar-powered development. We will launch a food hub later this summer, linchpin between the farm community and the local food market. But that's what we've done so far. And then a couple of last thoughts. We pay for sustainability whether we get it or not. So when people say, boy, I love the ideas of sustainability and fairness and decency and all that, but we just can't afford it. My answer back is you can't afford not to. And we now have several decades of data that show that, for example, in green building, if you aren't making it hyper green, you're going to lose money on it. Make it green, make it efficient, make it all those things that are now possible for architects and engineers to do. This is part of what I'm seeing in my world. We're in a revolutionary era. These are Harvard students fighting about divestment. These are climate petitioners asking that the courts give young people standing on climate issues up in the Northwest. This is the same thing in a court decision in The Hague last year, the same basic argument. This is Pope Francis, who I think has changed the dialogue a good bit with his encyclical last year, Laudato Si, which is a very powerful document. I've read through it 3 or 4 times. Every time I reread it, I find something new and something very different. But this is powerful. It's changed it from merely an economic argument now to a moral argument. This is a group at Sonoma State University, kids in school that have started their own farm co-op and getting food to the university there. And so for those of you who are students, my last thoughts are these. This is Thomas Merton, who was the great Trappist monk, and he was asked by his alma mater at Columbia University to write a short article on the secrets of his success for the Alumni magazine. And he said he was appalled. And what he wrote back to them was he had no interest in helping people become successful. So he said his advice was to be anything you like. Be madmen, drunks, bastards of every shape and form, but at all costs avoid one thing, success. And of course, he's talking about success as we define it customarily in American life. And that's part of the issue. So for students, that's an important kind of challenge, to live up to their highest dreams and do the things that they really want to do in the world, not things they think will add up to success in that way. The conclusion of this talk is this. All this issue of sustainability represents a massive political failure. I'm a political scientist by training, but the political system could not handle this issue, at least the way it was constituted. And so this is a political issue. And number two up here, this is a systemic civilizational failure. This is not something that we'll solve with just simply better technology. This means a rethinking, and Pope Francis used the word integral in discussing this. This means the integration of lots of different issues. The problem we have is this is not how we educate. We educate by silos and departments and disciplines, and we break things into fragments. But this is a big issue. We have to learn to do systems thinking and extend our horizon to a farther horizon. Now, what do we do? Well, I don't know what we do. But I do know where I am, an anchor institution in a small Ohio town, we could lead. And we've got money, we've got brain power, we've got buying power. We can begin to harness those things for long-term sustainable development within Oberlin. And then if we're smart about it, we can extend this to wider areas. But we can begin to do the things that are just obvious, where people, future generations, will see them as not being difficult, just merely obvious, whether we saw them or not. And two thoughts on education. Everything you do here, everything, every course, every department, it's all environmental education. We teach young people that they're part of or a part from the creation. And then the ecological disorder, all those slides I had in the beginning, that's not an anomaly. That was the working out of a system that was designed, not by any intention, but it was the way it played itself out. It couldn't do anything but warm the planet. It was designed around fossil fuels. And so the point here is that this ecological disorder that confronts us every day in the papers and every day in every scientific journal I would pick up, that disorder is a prior disorder of the way we think and how poorly we think about a lot of things that are really critically important. And so this means this comes back to us in the world of education. This is number 8 on the list of things. This is number 1. And it involves every department, every discipline. But the question then is, this is a crisis of education. It's not just a little problem in education. And to redesign and rethink the way we teach and how we think, and I'll leave it to you to discuss that maybe in Q&A. So, 2 last slides. Robert Fulgham gave a talk at Oberlin, 20-some years ago now. And it was based out of, his talk was based out of that little book. Remember that book, All I Ever Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten? Well, I think this is a pretty good way to think about sustainability. It's a word nobody really understands, but when you boil it down, it means play fair, clean up your messes, share your cookies, don't take things that aren't yours. And in dangerous times, hug each other, hold hands crossing the street, band together. And this is a pretty good way to think about sustainability for me. And then finally, the last thought here is, so what is education for, whether it's Oberlin or La Verne or whatever, wherever? I think Albert Einstein said it as well as it can be said. It is to widen our circles of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty.